everyone to the last day of Octia's Cleantech Week at the park. I'm very happy to see many of you joining today again. You probably all know me. My name is Maike Althaus. I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Clean Technology Industry Association, and I'm joining you from Toronto today, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Here with me today, as you can see on the screen, I have Dianne Saxe, the Deputy Leader of the Green Party of Ontario, as well as Mike Schreiner, the leader of the Green Party of Ontario. And Mike is, of course, also MPP for Guelph. So quick shout out to two of our members, the City of Guelph and Innovation Guelph. Hope you are witnessing this conversation today. Also here with me is Tyler Hamilton. Tyler is Director of Ecosystem Development, Cleantech Venture Services at Mars Discovery District. And before I hand over to Tyler, I'd like to take a few minutes and to thank our sponsors and partners. Our gold sponsor, RxN Reaction Hub. They are building, it's a KPM spinoff, and they are creating a new Chemtech commercialization hub in Kingston. I'd also like to thank our silver sponsor, MyTags, and our bronze sponsor, DryStill, as well as Canada Cleantech Alliance, Cleantech North, CSI Climate Ventures, Energy Storage Canada, and the Ontario Sustainable Energy Association, who've helped promote this event. Thank you very much for that. Few quick announcements, and then we'll start right away. So on the Octia front, we're officially launching Circular Connect. In the next days, Circular Connect is a program for or with NRC IRAP, connecting cleantech companies with circular economy solutions with engineering consultants, and each company is eligible to receive up to $25,000 to work with their consultants. We're also planning a hydrogen pitch event in May, showcasing the companies that have participated in our Hydrogen Connect program. So similar to the Circular Economy Connect, we connected companies with potential solutions for the hydrogen economy with engineering consultants. And to close this project, we'll have a little bit of a showcase and looking to involve adopters such as the Natural Gas Innovation Fund, Enbridge, and potentially a few others. And we have more interesting events in the works. So stay tuned. If you aren't subscribed to our newsletter, I urge you to do so. And with that, I'll hand over to Tyler.
Thank you very much. And welcome to Dianne and Mike and Dianne's puppy. I know that there's a puppy on the call. All puppies welcome. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. We were just talking before we went live that I've known you, both of you, for many years now, from my previous life when I was a reporter at the Toronto Star, and have interviewed you throughout that time, and also I guess when I was at Corporate Knights magazine. So now I'm interviewing you from a different perspective, and there's not going to be any kind of breaking stories the next day that'll shock you in the paper. So you can breathe a sigh of relief there. Just to kind of build on what Maike was saying. Obviously, she pointed out Mike is leader of the Green Party of Ontario. He's the longtime leader, 13 years so far and counting. So congrats, Mike, on that record. You know, before entering politics, people should know that Mike was a successful entrepreneur and a small business owner, and one of the early advocates of the local food movement. He grew up on a farm, something that I did not know, which for him instilled a passion for protecting people and the planet at a very young age. And his need to help tackle the climate crisis and income inequality is a big part of what I think motivated him to enter politics. So again, welcome, Mike. Dianne, who is leader of our deputy leader of the Green Party, but also a candidate for the riding of University Rosedale, is one of the world's leading environmental lawyers and has been recognized provincially and globally for her work. She currently practices law, focusing on the climate crisis, and serves as the chair of Toronto City Council's Climate Advisory Committee. From 2015 to 2019, many will remember that Dianne was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario before a certain government decided to shut down that commission. So welcome, Dianne. So let's get started. We've got a good list of questions here. Just before I ask the first one, I'm just going to remind the audience that we will be taking questions from audience members. So you can just drop them in the Q&A when you get a chance. Okay, first question. So what does success look like for you, as you know, if the Green Party came to power in Ontario, and how can the clean tech sector help you achieve that? And I guess I'll start with Mike, and then we can go to Dianne.
Yeah, sounds good, Tyler. And so first of all, just thank you to the Ontario Clean Tech Industry Association for inviting us to participate today. And just thank you for all the fantastic work all of your members do in helping make Ontario to be in a position to be a giant in the new climate economy. And I think success for us is being able to implement our roadmap to net zero plan in a way that can crush climate pollution using existing technology in half by 2030 to be truly net zero by 2045, and to make Ontario a global leader in the new climate economy, working with the clean tech sector to deliver the solutions to the challenges of the climate crisis that we face. And Tyler, I'm just going to say that I believe in honesty in politics. And I think it's probably highly unlikely that we're going to go from one green MPP to forming government in the next 55 days or so.
But I had to put it that way, to be fair. I had to put it that way. You never know.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I think I'd make a great premier, and I think Dianne would make a fantastic deputy premier and minister of the environment. But that being said, I think we've punched well above our weight at Queen's Park. One, advancing solutions. Two, working across party lines. Even when being fully critical of the Ford government, you know, I was able to work with one of their members to pass a bill to make life a little better for electric vehicle drivers. But I think, and we've helped mobilize Ontarians to push back against some of the worst excesses of the current government's efforts to dismantle environmental protections. And I say that because I think success for us is building on the success of our first green MPP to elect additional MPPs to maximize our influence in the legislature. And I think in particular, I'm just honored and excited to have Dianne Saxe running for the Ontario Green Party. And I would say, and I told this to Dianne before she decided to run for the Greens, that whatever party Dianne Saxe would run for, her voice in the Ontario legislature would be a gift to the people of this province, and especially anyone who cares about addressing the climate crisis. And on some of your subsequent questions, I'm going to ask Dianne to take the lead on those, because she's been the lead author on the Ontario Greens Climate and Environment Plan, which I would argue is the most ambitious, detailed, and doable plan for Ontario to do its fair share of addressing the climate crisis that any political parties ever put forward, and to have her voice in the legislature to help implement as many parts of that plan as possible, I think would be a gift to our present and future generations of this province. And we want to work with the Ontario clean tech sector to make that happen and to deliver on the economic opportunities that we can build for Ontarians, creating new career and better job opportunities in the new climate economy.
So, you know, why don't we start there then? Like, Dianne, if you want to kind of give some highlights of the plan and how that would impact the province and the various, you know, as you know, clean tech, clean energy encompasses a lot of stuff, right? It's not just this kind of monolithic term. So it's gonna affect different people on this call in different ways. So I'd just be curious for you to run through some of those highlights.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Tyler, for the invitation, and Mike for your kind words. The roadmap is 80 pages long, so I'm not going to be able to go through all of it, but there are 3 foundation elements that are essential. The first is a serious carbon budget. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been absolutely clear. It's lovely hearing people talk about net zero by 2050, but that's not what drives climate damage. It's the total amount of pollution that we're putting into the natural world. And so no political party in Canada, as far as I know, other than we, have started with a serious climate budget, a fair share carbon budget for the rest of the century, because that is what matters. And that is making that legally binding drives everything else. So once we know how much we've got left to use, then the question is, okay, this stuff is really precious and we have to make it last as long as possible, and we have to do the most with it, because when it's gone, it's gone. How do we stay within that budget? The first thing we have to have, in addition to a serious carbon budget, is a serious carbon price, which, as everybody knows, the current government has opposed at every possible step in the way. So we've, based on the extensive economic research, we have a serious carbon price, goes up $25 a ton per year till $300, because even the current federal price, if it continues to go up at the rate they're planning, even by 2030, doesn't create a business case, for example, for changing the source of heating for buildings. It's just not enough to match all the talking that they do about, oh yes, they want this, that, and the other, even though they're meanwhile buying pipelines and proving oil drills and so on. So serious carbon budget, serious carbon price. And the third piece is electrification. So Ontario is a fossil fuel importer. That means that we drain something between $16 and $25 billion every single year out of Ontario just to import fossil fuels. That's close to $1 trillion in a generation. And all that leaves behind is pollution. If we kept that money in Ontario, we can have a much more thriving economy with 800,000 more jobs and cleaner air and better health, and in many ways, better communities. And what do we replace all those fossil fuels with? Well, first of all, there's a lot of the fossil fuels that we need, that we're using now that we don't need, that are necessary, that we should get rid of. We need to design urban forms so people can get around by transit and walking and biking and other things that don't need fossil fuels as much as possible. But for the energy uses that are left, we need to provide them with electricity that we make right here in Ontario. And what we've shown in our plan is how we do that and how quickly we can do that, given the extraordinary reductions in costs that have occurred in solar, in wind, in biomass, in storage, and in green hydrogen, which is we're going to need for seasonal storage. So with those three things, which no one else in Canada is serious about, a serious carbon budget, a serious carbon price, and electrifying our economies quickly and cleanly, all the other pieces flow from that. And the innovators in your association, your membership, are exactly the kind of people who are needed to make all these different pieces work together. As you know, Tyler, I do a podcast. I host a podcast called Green Economy Heroes, where I've had the pleasure of interviewing now more than 70 of Canada's green business leaders, all sizes of businesses, big to tiny, north, south, east, and west. And it continues to astonish me how many different ways there are to reduce our carbon footprint and, in most cases, produce other benefits as well. And I know Mars has been really prominent in finding climate champions and giving them started. So we know
I was just going to say, you haven't had me on your podcast yet. So
are you running a profitable business?
Non-for-profit. So
no, but this is a business podcast.
Okay. All right. I'm just joking.
No, listen, if people have gone to pitch me about being on the show, if you've got a commercial business that's reducing our carbon footprint, especially if it's something I haven't covered already, tell me. If you're a woman or a person of color or Indigenous in particular, tell me, because it's really hard to find enough of those folks. But the fact is that we have an extraordinarily educated and diverse population. This is an outstanding global asset in terms of new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of bringing ideas together. And we should be jumping on that to build the new climate economy, because the one we keep pursuing now, we know is not only taking us to environmental disaster and moral disaster, it's taking us to economic disaster because the rest of the world's moving on.
So all of that is good. Like it sounds like exactly what's needed, right? But the question you'll always get back is there's a difference between what we know needs to happen and what is politically possible. And like, how will Ontario voters react to the idea of a $300 price on carbon and how that ripples through the economy or their purchasing? How will we do these, what would require basically hard cuts to, like, let's take an example. Back when the Wynne government, I remember a draft plan that they had to get everybody off of natural gas in homes, right? And there was a leak of the draft. I think it was in the Globe and Mail. And the amount of outcry about just even talking about getting homes off of natural gas for heating and electrifying, even though there are ways to do it, right? Like, we haven't really thought about it thoroughly or had a frank discussion as a province towards doing that. But it came across as like a hard cut. This has to happen really, really soon. And I think it backfired for the governing Liberals at the time. So how do you balance the political side of things, right? Like making it politically palatable versus what's really needed to actually, achieve the targets that we set out under the Paris Climate Accord.
Yeah, Dianne, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the first stab at that, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. Tyler, one on carbon pricing, the fact that we take over the federal program and we return everything that we collect from households back to households through a carbon dividend or a rebate. And we return everything back to businesses through programs to support businesses to decarbonize. And I'll go back to another Liberal example, since you brought up some Liberal examples. I remember being in Queen's Park when all the protests against the HST were happening, and everyone said that was going to bring down the McGuinty government. And then everyone got their HST rebate check in the mail, and suddenly they weren't that opposed to the HST anymore. And I think the same thing is a case with carbon rebates. And I think part of the mistake the federal government is correcting now is that nobody knows they're getting a rebate in their income tax because it's hidden. And if you make it visible to people, then people know that they are getting a rebate, and they can then use that rebate to, buy an electric bike, or, help to finance a retrofit of their home, etc. So that's one. Two, I don't think there's ever been a moment, and this is especially relevant right now, given the debate that's happening literally at Queen's Park right now, around the pain that people are feeling at the pumps when they fill their car up with gasoline. And, I've been standing up in the legislature, gave a very impassioned speech last night against the gas tax cut, why we would, try to incentivize increasing fossil fuel consumption when we're literally facing a now or never time to act on climate. But what I've been telling people is, here's a huge opportunity to electrify transportation in a way that's actually going to save you money. And I want to tell you, I was up in Sudbury recently, and I was plugged into a high-speed charger at a Petro-Canada station. And I had a gentleman walk over to me, and he said, "How much is it costing you to fill your car up there?" And I'm like, well, at home it costs like $5, but here it's probably going to cost me 15 to 20. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I just spent $100 to fill my car up with gas." And I'm like, yeah. I'm the leader of the Ontario Green Party, and I'm up here telling folks that, like, let's make electric vehicles affordable for the average person, so you can fill your car for $5 instead of $100. And then I would say, when it comes to housing affordability, which I would say is the other big one, like housing and fuel are the big things people are talking about right now. It's like, the big sprawl agenda is just going to force people into these long, soul-crushing commutes just to be able to find a place to live. And most people I talk to, they want to live close to where they work. They want to live in a community where, they can have an affordable place to call home where they can live, work, play, and shop locally. And so, the idea that, our only choice is tall or sprawl, and that, you're going to be forced to be in a car for hours in order to find an affordable place to call home is just an expensive lifestyle that I don't think most people want anymore. And so we can reimagine our communities to build 15-minute communities where people can, walk and cycle safely, where they can access affordable, reliable, electrified public transit. And when they need to drive, we have great charging infrastructure, so it costs them a fraction of what they're paying now to get around. So I think there are affordable solutions that we can relate to people's day-to-day lives to show them that we can address the climate crisis and the affordability concerns they have.
Dianne, did you want to weigh in there?
I'm happy with Mike's answer. It's fine. The only other example I wanted to give is I interviewed a young man who is running an e-bike business, making e-bikes in Nova Scotia. And he holds the Guinness World Record for the longest ride on an e-bike. He rode more than 8,000 kilometers on an e-bike. Do you want to guess what the fuel cost for that 8,000 kilometer ride?
$100.
$6.
Wow.
So a lot, I mean, really the bottom line there is that the opponents of action always frame it as taking action to protect a livable world is about pain and loss. But in fact, there's so much about clean that's awesome. And in fact, that ought to be the motto of your organization, that clean is awesome. And we should be hearing more stories from your members about how the things you do make life better. And here's another really simple example. I'm in the middle of getting the gas stove out of my house. And one of the reasons is, of course, the house will be much more comfortable in the summer when we're not heating the house up. But the main reason is it's now really clear that it's a public health hazard to have a gas stove in your kitchen. It's associated with a huge increase in childhood asthma. Like if the question here is, boy, you're making me change my gas stove, or wouldn't you like your kid to grow up with healthy lungs? It's a different question.
Yeah, certainly. And there's no debating it. As you know, I've been, a clean tech kind of advocate, follower, worshiper for about 15 years now. So in many ways, I'm being devil's advocate, but I do think that the suddenness, like there is we need to do stuff now, and we need to kind of do a clean break. My column was called Clean Break when I was writing, right? So there's the reality that we kind of need to do that, but people need time to adjust to change, and I question whether or not we can achieve that right balance in time without getting that kind of reacting pendulum swinging the other way, right? Because you are balancing the cost of things. People are suffering, and particularly where a lot of political parties fall down, as well as media and other organizations, is we're kind of out of touch with people of kind of lower class, kind of lower paid jobs, and that who are struggling today, have been struggling for many years, and there's just layers on other stuff on top of them. Buying an electric car is still expensive, even if you get a subsidy for somebody who works at Tim Hortons every day, right? So there are things that need to be balanced.
Right. So let me talk about that for a bit. You'll see, if you get a chance to look at our roadmap, and I put the link in the chat. There are three pillars to the roadmap as a whole. One is crushing climate pollution. One is protecting water and nature. And the third is succeeding together. So the third piece is about that question, about equity, and how do we leave nobody behind? How do we make this work for more people? The conservative approach is, let's subsidize consumption, so it's cheaper to use things that are destroying the world. To us, that's exactly the wrong direction. If we think about, well, what can make life more affordable, make life better for people who are struggling at lower incomes? Well, one of the things is they shouldn't have to own a car. We have in Ontario, even nearly half of the people in the lowest income decile, people who make the least money in the whole province, have to own a car because they can't get where they need to go any other way. And that is an enormous financial burden on them. You remember Glenn Murray talking about the biggest raise he ever got in his life was when he got rid of his car. Well, people can't get rid of their car if we design our communities so the only way to get around is by a car. It's a much better quality of life and much less expensive if we have really good transit and really good walking and biking with things nearby. So for example, the Ford government's focus on transit is let's tear up all of downtown Toronto for 4 years, right, to build this multi-billion-dollar subway line. It's going to take a very, very long time, cause enormous economic damage, including in the area of the city that you're in, for a long period of time. And it's only going to provide transit in a certain limited area. Whereas for a tiny fraction of the money, with almost no disruption, and at very high speed, we could be putting in dedicated bus lanes on existing roads and buying electric buses for them. And if you have that, then you have fast, clean, comfortable, reliable transit with onboard Wi-Fi that gets people to work on time, because with a dedicated bus lane, buses are very fast. And that makes life better for a lot of people. And if you combine that with the kind of small bus and dispatching system that we see in Stratford and Belleville already, bus on demand, we can provide really good transit quickly and cheaply so that people don't have to be buying $100 worth of gas every week to get to work. They will have a good way to get to work another way.
Yeah, and the company for Stratford and Belleville that does that is Pantonium, which is a company that Mars works very closely with. And they make it possible for people to travel across large distances without having to transfer, right? So that's a big part of a problem for people, is having to, like, this fragmented transit system where there's too many points where you have to transfer. So there is technologies out there to certainly improve the convenience of transit, as well as reduce, of course, the emissions that result from current transit vehicles. We've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, but before I get into asking those, I just wanted to ask each of you, the Ontario Clean Technology Industry Association, the key words here are clean technologies. So this is an organization. Mars is the same, where we focus on technology. And I can appreciate technology isn't the only part of the solution, right? A lot of it is around behavioral change, new approaches to building and designing the cities and how we work and live. But keeping the theme on technology, what would each of you say are your top 3 favorite kind of clean technologies that are going to be an important part of the solution to achieving our emission reductions?
Well, Tyler, I'm going to point you to the clean economy section of our roadmap. And I'll read you the key paragraph, right? Because I knew you were going to ask what we thought were really high priorities for Ontario. So this is what we said: by investing wisely in greener choices for a healthier future, Ontario can be a leader in electric vehicle manufacturing and low pollution travel, healthy, efficient homes, sustainable forestry and responsible mining, energy storage, and networks. So these seem to be the best opportunity we have to build on the enormous strengths that we have. And if you want more detail about that, we did a press conference a week or 2 ago about our electric vehicle supply chain strategy, where we looked at this whole range of issues that we need to have a strong industry here on electric mobility, whether it's buses or fire trucks or e-bikes or the whole range of ways of getting around. And so we looked at supporting demand, supporting a skilled workforce, including our free tuition, college tuition, and a year of guaranteed employment for 60,000 young people, Indigenous-led access to critical minerals, because just pretending there aren't any Indigenous people isn't going to work anymore. Low carbon inputs, including particularly our electricity, sophisticated business financing, which Toronto has the strength in, supporting cutting edge research, including places like Mars, building on the local companies we have who already have expertise on producing cathode active materials, make equipment for making batteries and so on. And of course, our strong automotive and parts industry. So we've got all these pieces and we've thought through, well, what does it need within an overall environmental context to have all these pieces actually work together? Because if they don't integrate, it's one bottleneck is enough to make it all fall down.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, just to really reemphasize the labor component, because I think one of the things that so many clean tech companies have talked to me about is just the challenges in finding staff and employees. And then the other one is the challenges around commercializing and scaling technology. And so we have a EV Mobility and Green Innovation Fund to help with that. We've put forward a proposal to raise an additional $4 billion through a climate bank to help fund that, and to also use just the power of public procurement as well. I can't tell you how many clean tech innovators have said, geez, if the government would just like buy our technology, we could sell it around the world. But we need some assistance with proof of concept to potential purchasers in other places. And so, I think there's a really important role for government to play in helping particularly finance the commercialization and scaling, and also to utilize public procurement to help businesses do proof of concept, which then they can export, across the country and around the world.
So I'm glad you raised the procurement issue. You're right. It is a big thing within the clean tech community, and Octia and Mars as well have been really pushing the federal government, the province, and municipalities, across the board, all levels of government, that we need to do a better job of adopting the innovations that are local. And so glad to hear that you think that's an important thing. I guess the question I would ask is, we've heard a lot of talk about the importance of green procurement, but how do you implement that, right? And there doesn't seem to be any end of reports coming out saying we need more of this. This is what we need to do, but we don't do it. And there's so what would be part of your plan to get over that?
Well, Tyler, I reported on this to the legislature already when I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. There are several pieces to procurement.
Mike's smiling. He's happy that you've got this one down.
Yeah, I mean, one piece is standards, right? We need to have standards, and particularly for the high intensity, high carbon content things like concrete and steel. And if she doesn't shut up, I'll have to toss her out of here. The second thing is that the government needs to pay attention. Okay, excuse me, Mike, you talk for a minute, I'll go talk.
Yeah. So I think the short stick end of it is when we put out requests for proposals and procurement criteria, to have that in the criteria, which enables companies to bid and be able to be scored properly, so we can support local technology and innovation. And oftentimes right now it's like low cost bid for everything. Well, the low cost bid isn't necessarily the low cost bid when you look at total life cycle cost or even net present value. So I think that's a big part of it. I'm going to let Dianne finish in a second, but why I have this here is sometimes even just removing the roadblocks. So for example, the Ontario Good Roads Association, who I'll be speaking with next week, they would like to see more recycled aggregate in all of our roads and highways and streets and et cetera. And it's perfectly safe and doable, but we have a number of municipalities that don't allow it, which makes absolutely no sense from a cost perspective or an environmental perspective. So in some ways, it's also removing some of those roadblocks that just currently exist from us fully utilizing the technologies that we have right now. Anyway, Dianne, I'm going to let you finish.
Sure. Anyway, there's a lot of expertise on procurement. It's a very specialized field. You'll see in our plan, one of the things we provided was some money for basically paying more in the short run to get things started. In the same way, when I bought my first hybrid car in 2003 or 4, it was more expensive than other cars, and it wasn't that wasn't that fantastic? But someone has to be the early adopter. It was one of the things that we saw at Glasgow, that COP26, was this coalition of people who stepped forward to say, we will be early adopters. We will buy the first 100,000 electric trucks or whatever the case may be, so that there is a market so that the manufacturers can gear up. That is an appropriate and essential role for government, is to be an early adopter. And that's partly a question of rules and regulations, and partly it's a question of habit. Public servants are frequently punished for taking any kind of risk. And the only way to do things that have no risk is to do something that's been done lots and lots of times before, which drives us into a future that's going to be catastrophic. So having a culture where we can try things out first, and accept that not all of them will work, having a budget to pay extra for the first step of things. So for example, you'll see in our plan, we've got 100,000 geothermal units, sorry, not 100,000, 100 geothermal units in schools to happen right, basically in the first 4 years. Why? Because the geothermal industry is still basically bespoke. So it's really expensive, hasn't had a chance to gear up, get any of the cost efficiencies. One of the cheapest places to put a geothermal unit is where you've got a large flat open area, which schools generally are surrounded with. And the schools need a better system because a lot of them are older and they don't have good HVAC systems. So we think we can really get the geothermal industry to take off and to be competitive by having the public sector pay for the first 100 units in places that we need and that are going to be, comparatively easy to do. And then we're helping everybody else, because by then it'll be a more sophisticated business. So that's the sort of thing that the public sector can do, needs to do. Here's another important thing about the public sector, is that the public sector is not going to go out of business in 5 or 10 or 15 years, like many private businesses. And so things with long-term paybacks make a lot of sense for the public sector, which is going to still need to pay for things. So if you think about social housing, for example, social housing in this province has traditionally been thrown up cheaply. And then you spend a lot of money trying to heat it. And it's brutally cold in the winter, brutally hot in the summer, miserable for the people living in them, and very expensive to operate because the initial purchase decision is only on the capital cost. The changing the purchase requirement to include total operating costs changes the entire purchasing dynamic, because now you're thinking about, well, what's the overall cost? And when you build a passive house, it costs a little more upfront. It costs almost nothing over time. And so you can quickly make it back. And even if it takes 10 years to make it back, a public organization is still going to need to be paying for that building. There's still going to be poor people in 10 years. So the public sector absolutely can do better procurement if we change the rules.
Yeah, another thing that I hear from the ventures that we work with is that the language around RFPs are too prescriptive as well. So it's almost like they're biased towards those incremental existing solutions that come from the established companies, whereas they need to be more outcome based, in the way they're written, so that they open up room for new innovations, new approaches to be proposed and weighed against that standard criteria that also includes a full costing.
Right.
So there'd be, yeah.
And one of the things that governments are terrified of is that if they try something new and they're not so sure about, and if it doesn't work perfectly, the Auditor General is going to rake them over the coals. And the Auditor General pays no attention to environmental benefits. She just counts money. And so if anything goes wrong, she criticizes. And that's also a question of what her mandate is. So if we want to be able to count the long-term consequences, not just the short-term things that are measured in money, we're going to have to change the rules for what we buy and how we measure the success of what we buy. And the fact is that we're getting near the end of normal. Things are going to be more and more unpredictable. There's going to be more and more change. There's going to be more and more destruction of infrastructure. There's going to be more and more stress and uncertainty. And so we're going to have to be willing to try new things because the old answers are increasingly going to fail. The question that we have is, do we want to be dragged into that through suffering, or do we want to march into it with some control and our heads up, which is what our plan is about, is we know what's coming. I mean, climate change, there's lots of details we don't know, but the big picture we absolutely know. Physics doesn't compromise, and it's coming. And so we think we should be looking ahead and taking advantage of the many opportunities to make clean awesome.
All right, last question related to procurement, because it's a big issue and I think it's very important for the Octia membership. It's also very important to the organization I'm with. I'm on the board of Octia, by the way, so I'm kind of speaking for both organizations. But you know, at Mars, we're really trying to work with other organizations, including Octia, to figure out how to get this green procurement, you know, buy clean or whatever you want to call it, procurement right for government. And you know, that could be, you know, reducing, making it easier to figure out how to even work with government, right? Because it can be complicated for a lot of smaller businesses. You know, as we know, SMEs represent the majority of businesses and jobs in a province like Ontario, but they are the ones that find it harder to access these kinds of opportunities and to go through the RFP process. On the issue of SMEs, though, how do you design procurement so that not only is it looking at the environmental benefits of it, but is also looking at the economic and domestic benefits of using solutions designed here, you know, built here, you know, R&D was paid for, innovated here, because again, you can set the criteria, but then when it comes down to bidding for it, you get kind of squeezed out by these much more well-resourced, large international firms who've got existing relationships. They've got teams of lawyers who are able to go through this process. And then the SME who's got the innovative thing that maybe is going to be more disruptive, a little bit riskier, but still commercial product, is trying to figure out how they can kind of get into this opportunity with government. So how do you balance the environmental stuff with the let's support local business stuff?
Right. Well, of course, there's also some trade law limitations, but I see that Martin Bro's on this conversation, and Martin did outstanding work at the Centers of Excellence in matching small businesses with solutions with the big businesses with problems. And that was, you know, just such a powerful and effective program. Just before the June 2018 election, when everything was swept away, I attended a conference where company after company stood up to talk about the power of those partnerships and how it had opened doors for both those who had solutions and couldn't find clients and those who had problems and couldn't find solutions. So basically, it was a concierge service based in really detailed knowledge and networks to help match people together. And we can also see some of those opportunities. Municipalities are also really interested in what they can do to support local employment. And it's part of the 50-minute city idea as well, as what can we do locally? So that there is a line to tread in terms of trade law, that you can't say only things that are made here, but you can have a whole series of criteria, and that you have to get away from either the lowest cost or the people who can phone the premier, right? So that you don't get the kind of decision we had 2 years ago where Walmart was allowed to keep selling the very same things that little stores couldn't sell.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is a lot of small businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises have talked about having a single window they go through across ministries for procurement, because obviously the siloed ministries and sometimes even different procurement processes in different ministries create significant complications if you don't have the resources to navigate the system. And so having, you know, one place to help guide SMEs through the public procurement process just helps organizations with less capacity, fewer resources navigate the system.
Yeah, and on Diane's point about the having to respect trade laws, there are ways around it, including having set-asides for small, medium-sized businesses in the bidding process, because even though that still opens it up to international bidders, it's harder for small and medium-sized businesses from other countries to participate in those versus the larger companies. So you kind of build in, and this unspoken bias into local companies for that process. So just something, Sarah Petrovan from Clean Energy Canada has been really pushing the federal government hard to kind of consider those kinds of set aside. Okay, I'm going to go into the questions that we've had. We've got a couple questions from the audience. First one is, how does the Green Party propose to implement the replacement of power by Pickering Nuclear Power Station with clean energy when this power station is shut down in 2024?
Well, we've got an extensive program on electricity. Basically, what we've said is we need to double solar and wind in the next 4 years, triple them again by 2030. We need to be building a significant hydrogen capacity to provide seasonal storage. One of the things I did as commissioner was examine in detail how we replaced the coal power that was used in Ontario. And you'll hear fossil apologists say, oh yeah, it was done with gas. Well, actually, no. I looked at exactly the amount of electricity that was provided by coal, and it was replaced entirely with conservation and renewables in Ontario. Now, conservation and renewables are not as dispatchable, so we do need other tools to match supply and demand. And I reported extensively on what those tools could be. But in the particular case of Pickering, we have already got quite a lot of electricity capacity that we don't use. We turn off our renewables an absurd amount of the time. So we should be using price tools to make sure that we have the maximum use of what we have generated here already. We may be able to do more power exchanges with Quebec. There are some upgrades that Hydro One is working on to make it a little easier to exchange power with Quebec. We already provide them with electricity in the winter when they have their peak, and they provide us some in the summer when we have our peak. We also do have to get serious about conservation. And as you know, and many of your members know, we had a really active and important electricity conservation program in Ontario, which was almost entirely scrapped by the Ford government, which we need to bring back. In addition to the fact, of course, that he's spending $6 or something billion a year of taxpayer money subsidizing electricity rates, which encourages waste. So we need to be more careful in what we use. We need to be more careful in when we use it, because we've got an almost double difference between low peak and high peak, and a huge proportion of the cost of the electricity system comes to providing that high peak stuff. And we can do a lot to reduce that. Here's a simple example. We're a summer peaking system right now. And that summer peak is because we have hot summer afternoons, which are getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. If you insulate the buildings and put solar on the roof, so I've got solar on my house, one of the things the solar did right away is it shades the house. So the house doesn't get as hot. And I'm generating electricity on all those hot afternoons, so I don't need to draw from the grid. Now that solar is so cheap and so adaptable and so efficient, so it can go on houses like mine, which faces east and west and not south, we have got opportunities to dramatically slice our peak, which will take a lot of cost pressure off the system, and we can fill in other energy needs. Ontario also has tremendous innovation in storage. So you know about HydroStore and the $250 million that they just got from Goldman Sachs, because they're one of the world's leading ways of cheaply, safely storing electricity with a hole in the ground with air and water in it. So we have the innovations here. Now, it's totally ridiculous that California and Australia are where they're going to grow because we're sitting on our behinds.
The only thing I would add to that is I'm just really excited about the opportunities in biodirectional charging and turning my electric vehicle into a mini peaker plant during the day and having it be an opportunity to even lower the cost of ownership of electrified public transit to, you know, fill it up overnight at a very low cost and put it back into the grid during the day when we can help address our peaking needs.
It's not an issue now, but in an ideal world, if we rushed to electrify most passenger vehicles and people are doing overnight charging, one thing that the current government is proposing, I don't think it's done yet, but they're proposing ultra overnight low fee charging, which I think is a good idea. It's long overdue. But if you got every car in the province charging overnight, and then you start working on having folks put in air source heat pumps or geothermal that do run on electricity, mind you, less electricity than existing resistance heating. But as a replacement for gas, as an example, that valley soon becomes smooth, right? And eventually you're going to have to build more. And then I guess going back to the original question that was asked, if you're shutting down a nuclear power station at the same time, I think people are kind of worried about those two opposing things. Like, we don't have a problem now, there's lots of room, but if it went the direction we want it to go, how do we fill that gap fast enough? And, you know, Germany's been struggling with this problem, right? Like, you know,
well, to be fair, Tyler, Germany just went cold turkey on their nukes without any real plan other than buying lots and lots of gas from Germany.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Russia. Yeah.
Okay.
But we were very fortunate, actually, is that one of the people who helped me write the roadmap was an expert with probably the most sophisticated model of Ontario's electricity system anywhere in the private sector. And so he worked with me on, okay, exactly what do we have to do and when do we have to do it? And that's why I said, we've got to double our solar and wind by 2026, triple it again by 2030, at the same time as we're adding storage and building out hydrogen. But we can do all of that. You know, it takes 10 or 20 years to build a nuclear plant. It takes, you know, often 30 years to build a transmission line. But solar and wind go up fast. They are the fastest way of generating electricity you can build. And increasingly, you save money by doing it. So we really can add renewables very, very quickly. And it provides a lot of other benefits. It can provide local resilience because we know there are going to be more and more disruptions from severe storms. So if you have local power generation, well, you don't have to be freezing in the dark or going through what Texas did last year. So we can have many benefits. Clean is awesome. There's so many things that this transformation allows us to do that we couldn't do before. I heard a wonderful talk by the head of Anglo-American, a giant mining company. And he said, the biggest thing that the current disasters are giving them is permission to try new things, which normally aren't permitted. And they're already saving 30% of their energy costs because they're trying new things to prepare for climate. So we can, in fact, make many things better by taking this climate lens a kick in the rear to say, all right, we need to do things better. Let's make them better. And, you know, your folks are providing many of the tools.
So just to shut down the nuclear discussion, excuse the pun. So no more new nukes is your policy, and then a gradual kind of shutdown of what we have is what we see, starting with obviously.
We're not saying, no, we didn't say shut down what we have. What we said is anything that's unsafe should shut.
Okay.
There is this question about the fuel tubes and the hydrogen levels in the fuel tubes, which honestly has not been publicly answered very persuasively. The Pickering is going to shut, not to anything to do with us. It's way past.
It's already had many extensions. Yeah,
it's way past its design life. It's very expensive to run, and even OPG doesn't want to keep running it. The Darlington and Bruce are different. So we collectively are in already billions and billions and billions of dollars to pay for the reconstruction of Darlington, and it's too late to stop that in any reasonable way. The Bruce is less clear because under the contract, every 2 units, there's a chance to look again and say, does it still make sense to spend another gazillion dollars, even though it's heavily front-end loaded to make that decision hard to make? It's not clear yet that particularly units 5 and 6 at Bruce will make sense, will make financial sense, even leaving aside creating some of the most dangerous waste in the world for 100,000 years. So we have no place to put. It just may not make financial sense, but we don't know that yet. Our policy says we've got these, we're not going to build new ones. They don't make financial sense for us. They don't make economic sense. We don't need them. It's cheaper as well as safer to meet our electricity needs with renewables and storage. Plus,
And
the next for as long as they run.
And small modular nuclear reactors.
Absolutely. Well, that's just advertising. That's like calling methane natural gas. It's no more natural than arsenic. There's nothing small about those reactors. The argument for them is, oh, yes, there'll be thousands of them ordered and then they'll be cheap to build. Well, do you remember when GE promised us that nuclear electricity was going to be too cheap to meter? Right? And it has never been cheap. And it's not going to be cheap now. And these modular reactors, they're bad for the Ontario electrical grid. They don't match our needs. I had OPG trying to tell me that we needed small modulars to meet our peak needs, which is total garbage. And they eventually retreated with their tail between their legs. It is nuclear and renewables clash. A certain amount of baseload nuclear, fine, but we already have way more baseload nuclear than we need. It's bigger than our base loads. Adding more to that just means we're going to waste more of our renewable capacity and creating all this terrible waste and at very high expense. The majority of the reason that our electricity rates has gone up, as I documented in the legislature, is because of nuclear. It gets blamed on solar, but the big reason is nuclear.
Okay, shifting to a different subject. The Ontario government released the hydrogen strategy today. Have either of you had a chance to go through it?
The so-called hydrogen strategy, it's a pretend hydrogen strategy. What they have is they have one small hydrogen storage electrolyzer that is going to be paid for, which makes sense for OPG anyway. In our plan, what we looked at is we need 15,000 megawatts of hydrogen electrolyzers in order to have real seasonal storage, because we have daily swings, we have weekly swings, and we have huge seasonal swings that our peak demands are, 22, 23, 24,000 megawatts, and our base load is 10, 11, 12. So we've got this giant gap. So we have to be able to make a lot of electricity spring and fall that we don't need and save it for the summer when we do need it. And we spend a lot of time looking at ways to save it. Some ways to save it are just as heat or cold, like the ice house at the Windsor Casino. It's really cheap to store ice. But we also need ways to make actual electricity, and hydrogen based on current technology is the best fit. And now we have the International Hydrogen Catapult, which is dramatically accelerating the technology and the economics of hydrogen. So what they've done is they've done a little tiny wee thing and put a fancy label on it. Very, very typical Ford.
There is a Ontario-based company called Hydrogen Optimized. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they founded by the son of the founder of Steward Energy. I don't know if you remember Steward Energy back in the early, the Hydrogenics ended up buying.
Yeah.
They've got a very low cost, like multi-megawatt size, like tens of megawatts hydrogen production type technology. So something exciting to watch. Because one of the issues with the current electrolyzer technology is we're not getting to the scale needed to have the kind of impact that's needed. So seeing solutions that can do it on that large of a scale, it's nice to see, and it's nice to see it coming out of Ontario. I'm going to just shift to a question from our chair of Octia, Peter MacArthur, who I'm sure you both know very well. So he says, great to see the level of knowledge from both of you, and that you acknowledge the clean tech sector strengths in Ontario. He's curious, and actually this was a question that I had as well, how the Green Party can work with other parties in Ontario to advance opportunities around clean tech. And like me, he says, if you do not form a government after the June election.
You know, I mean, I'll give this to Mike in a minute, but my view of the role of the Green Party is very similar to a lot of what I did as commissioner. As commissioner, I didn't get to order anybody around. I didn't get to write gazillion-dollar checks for anybody. But what I did get to do was to tell the truth and to put on the table what good policy looks like, which, you know, the government would sometimes adopt afterwards, pretending it was their own idea. The Green Party does much the same. Our roadmap to net zero is a really detailed benchmark, and we encourage you and your members and the other parties to use it as a benchmark. We know that the other parties are borrowing from it. That's fine. It's fine. You know, what we're in it for is a livable future for today's young people. So providing the ideas, providing the documentation, doing all that detailed electricity modeling that we had access to, that nobody else had access to, we put that on the table. And then anybody who wants to can use it. We're prepared to work with anybody of goodwill. And there are good people in all the other parties. And we're, you know, one of the reasons Mike is the most effective backbencher, or at least not backbencher, the effective single MPP in the legislature, is that he works along well with everybody else. He's respected by everyone. He doesn't make it personal. He's knowledgeable. He fights for what's right, and in a respectful and collaborative way. And he will continue to do that. And I hope I get to help him.
Yeah, no, I would just add, and thanks for the kind words, Dianne, is we've already have a demonstrated track record of being able to work across party lines to get things done. I think I opened in my opening remarks at a time when I was just hammering the Ford government on dismantling Ontario's climate action plan. And, you know, they were in the early stages of starting to dismantle environmental protections as well. And, you know, I was still able to work with the whip, the conservative whip of all people, to pass a bill to help electric vehicle drivers. I was the first spearheaded the first bill in Ontario's history that was co-sponsored by all four political parties to declare the month of August Emancipation Month. And, you know, Emancipation Canada came to me and said, you know, we've been told that if there's one political party that can get all the others to work together, it's the Green Party. So can you make this happen? And we did. And I think Dianne is right that, you know, by holding government accountable, but doing it in a respectful way and doing it in a way that, you know, puts people before politics and puts just good public policy ahead of political self-interest, we've shown that we can move the needle, you know, on a number of issues. And oftentimes, you know, other parties, you know, borrow our ideas. And I think, you know, there was a part of me that was joking, you know, the old book out there, steal this, like maybe that's what we should do with a lot of our policies. And the most recent one is we were the first party in Ontario's history to put out a standalone mental health strategy. And literally like a month and a half later, the NDP put one out that was almost our policy, other than ours talks about how you can pay for it and theirs doesn't. So we'll work with them on that. And so I was asked about it the next day by a number of journalists. And I said, you know, this just opens up opportunities for collaboration when other parties, you know, take our good ideas and run with them. The only thing I would say is that if we're truly going to maximize our influence and our ability to really show how you can collaborate across party lines, we need more green MPPs. And, you know, you know, if I could be partisan for just a second, you know, if the sector can get behind some of our champions who really have an opportunity to be elected and be a strong voice in the legislature, and I would put Dianne as one of those, it would just help us maximize our influence and really move the needle, especially when it comes to addressing the climate crisis and really making Ontario the successful Ontario businesses in the new climate economy.
You mentioned electric vehicles, and it just made me remember this question that I had is, I almost feel like there's not a demand issue around electric vehicles, there's a supply issue, and we can create all these incentives around it. But the fact is you go into any car dealership and you're waiting 6 months and they're not on the show floor and you can't take them for test drives. Is there anything that the government can do, or the Green Party, if it were to become the government, could deal with that bottleneck? Because I'm kind of honestly, I'm perplexed at how we can keep pushing the demand side, but not addressing the supply side.
Well, again, Tyler, as you know, the inability to buy cars in Ontario was created after Ford trashed our climate action plan and the incentives. And so even the auto dealerships that had spent $1 million getting themselves set up out of their own pocket to sell electric cars can't get cars anymore because the automakers just moved them somewhere else. And that was a very deliberate and foreseeable and foreseen consequence of Ford's destruction of our program. I mean, again, I talked a little bit about the new climate economy and how the rest of the world is forging ahead and we're sitting back, thinking about past glories and being left behind. Well, that's a perfect example, is that electric vehicle sales are exploding all around the world. Although I will say it's not just, when I say electric vehicles, it's not just cars. I was amazed to find out that there were more e-bikes sold in the US last year than e-cars. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense because they're cheap and they're easy to store and they're fun to ride and they can do a lot of the same things, not everything, but a lot of the same things that a car can do in terms of providing personal transportation. So we would absolutely create the conditions. I mean, the car dealers are still selling the internal combustion cars and they can, and there's lots of demand for them because gasoline is still comparatively cheap and people are used to them. But we would have a rapid phase out of the sale. We would have a fee-based system. So there'd be, in order to provide the incentives on the clean cars, there would be extra fees on the dirty cars. So there would be a cost premium on selling the dirty cars. And it's going to be harder and harder to drive a dirty car if we provide road pricing and we reassign road space to bus lanes and bike lanes and so on. And so that the conditions that create the demand for the dirty cars need to change. We can't leave everything else the same and assume that people in the economy will change. It won't. And this raises, you know, at a fundamental level, this really existential question of whether democracies are going to be able to change in time to avoid climate destruction. Because, you know, Václav Smil has been really, really articulate and well researched on how long it normally takes for an energy transition. I don't know if you read any of his books.
Yeah, he's the Bill Gates' favorite author, and I have interviewed him a couple of times as well.
Right. So his latest book, Grand Transition, sort of ends up with to say, after 100,000 stats, energy transitions are really slow. It would be astonishingly difficult to make this transition fast enough to avoid slamming into the climate limits. Let's hope that the climate limits really aren't that bad, or that maybe we'll be able to adapt. And, you know, to me, that's betting the planet on magic. I don't think we can do that. He's right. It's very hard to make a fast energy transition. And he's right that there's an enormous inertia in just continuing to do the same thing and same thing and same thing and same thing. And that's part of why we're in the situation that we're in. But if we want to save ourselves, we're going to have to change. One thing we know is that the green transition is coming. It's inevitable. Physics will win. What we don't know is how much suffering there's going to be along the way, how much suffering and how much destruction. And so the fact is we have another path. We have another path that will make things better. It does require change. Change can be hard to get started, but once you get started, it can go faster than anybody thought possible.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think the public sector has a huge role to play. And so just this morning, I was being interviewed by a reporter from Automotive News and was challenging me a little bit on our policy around supporting a ZEV mandate, and was saying, do you really need that? And I said, well, yeah, we do actually, because how can we in good conscience know when somebody buys a new vehicle, for example, and that's maybe a decade or longer purchase for them, that we're actually allowing them to buy an internal combustion engine car when we know that in the lifetime of that car, that it's going to become obsolete due to climate. And the same thing when it comes to home heating, when talking about getting fossil gas out of homes. I mean, I think government has a role to play through building code mandates, et cetera, to make sure that we're not forcing people to, or not putting people in a position where they're going to purchase technology that's going to be really obsolete and essentially a stranded asset for them during the life cycle of that particular, electric vehicle or furnace, for example, home heating furnace. And so I think government does have a role to help guide, not intervene in the details of the marketplace, but certainly put in place a framework that guides the marketplace so we don't put people in very challenging financial situations because of purchases they've made that have a longer life cycle.
One of the, you mentioned like natural gas, and well, first of all, the current government, as well as the previous government, used this special fund to subsidize expansion of natural gas infrastructure into new communities. Can we assume that would stop if your party had a say?
Absolutely. You'll see in our plan, no new fossil lock-in, no new pipelines, no new highways. We follow the lead of the International Energy Agency that after 2025, there should be no new fossil burning equipment installed either.
Mm-hmm. And that's the International Energy Agency founded by the oil and gas sector. So that's
exactly. Yeah, I always remind reporters here at Queen's Park that that's a pretty conservative or
yeah,
a pretty pro oil and gas organization. So maybe we as a province should be listening to them. I tried to oppose the current government's natural gas rollout legislation. It was unsuccessful in my opposition to it. But certainly in the process of doing that, we had people from both the air source heat pump industry and the geothermal industry come and talk about the fact that there's a business case that they are finding, like both of those industries are certainly financially competitive in terms of long-term return on investment. And it's just unfortunate the current government, who says they're all for, market economics, refused to listen to some of the market economics that was being presented around, that rolling out fossil gas wasn't necessarily where you had the strongest business case.
Yeah, increasingly the strategy that we're hearing from various players, some of the ventures that we work with and some of the other companies out there, is that stop the expansion, stem the bleeding kind of thing, and then to help with the adjustment period, because there's still a gap between the electricity prices and gas prices are still relatively low, moving towards that kind of dual fuel hybrid model, right, where you put an air source heat pump in your home and you're able to switch back and forth and immediately start reducing gas use by like 50%. And then over time, you get more and more of that gas grid filled with hydrogen to reduce the carbon content of that gas as a transition strategy. Now, what do you think of that? Like, I know, again, it comes down to, is it going to be fast enough? But is it better than doing nothing? Because that's what we seem to be doing as a province right now.
Well, Tyler, anything's better than nothing, but small steps, spending a lot of time and money on small interim steps when we need to take big steps is probably not going to get us where we need to go. I mean, the idea of using gas as where you have existing gas infrastructure, keeping it as a backup for extreme weather, that was something that I reported on, that it makes sense in the short run. It doesn't make sense to build any new things. And to some extent that can be done right away. Again, I have a very old house with terrible walls. And a gas stove, a gas boiler that I was told was very efficient. But we put in a heat pump in the room we use the most, and that way we keep the rest of the house quite a bit cooler. And we keep the kitchen warm when we need it warm. And that has allowed us to dramatically reduce our gas consumption. So that's a really low tech, easy adjustment that also gives us air conditioning in the kitchen, which is a good thing in the summer now as the summers get hotter. So there are some ways that we can do things that help us get where we're needing to go. The idea of putting a lot of hydrogen into the gas line, though, I looked at that. I don't think that makes any sense. We've got so many other better uses of hydrogen, and we've got so many other better ways of keeping people warm in the winter and cool in the summer by improving the efficiency of buildings, making all new buildings passive house standards. Even things like solar on the roof so you don't heat the building up as much. Putting hydrogen in the gas line is the least productive use of hydrogen. And hydrogen is precious. So we should be using it first for the hard to abate sectors like long distance transport and some kinds of industrial high heat. You know, you can't do enough to make metallurgical steel, for example, without really high heat. Hydrogen can do that in ways that other forms of energy maybe can't. And we, as I said earlier, we're going to need a significant amount of hydrogen to provide seasonal electricity storage because of our seasonal mismatch. If we had lots more hydrogen after that, after we provided the transportation needs, after we've provided all the industrial needs, after we've provided the chemical building block needs, I mean, then maybe would it make sense to burn some of it? But, you know, it seems like a pretty idiotic thing to me.
Well, there you have it. But you do still think that the kind of using the gas as a backup is a good short-term measure, because you're going to be, you know, dealing with the gas companies and that embedded infrastructure. You don't want to lock in more, you know, in terms of new builds, but to render those assets kind of worthless overnight by saying no more connectivity. I don't know, just curious if that's even possible.
That's not what we're looking at. But stopping the bleeding is the most important. When you're in a hole and you have to get out, the first thing you have to do is stop digging. So building more fossil fuel infrastructure is, as the UN Secretary General said, I mean, it's moral and economic insanity. But it will take time to retrofit buildings. Existing buildings are hard to retrofit really well. And one thing we know about the way temperature is changing is that the average winter temperature is getting quite a bit warmer. We're warming more in the winter and more at night than we are in the summer. But the cold extremes are going to be the same. So we need to provide a larger temperature range, and the cold extremes are going to stay really cold. So we can expect comparatively short but really, really cold periods and especially as the jet stream weakens and we get these polar vortexes falling out, one of the things that we see is that weather doesn't move through as fast as it used to. Canada used to be internationally known, apparently, as a hit and run weather country. Every 3 days we would get something different. And now with the jet stream weakening, we're going to have things last longer. So we do need some peaking capacity. And even for electricity system, you'll see we say we should keep a small amount of fossil gas generation available for extreme conditions. So that makes sense. But we need to, one of the things about the high carbon price is it will make that gas really expensive. Going back to when I was a young lawyer, gas was a premium fuel that was used only for special occasions. It wasn't the base fuel. It got super cheap because of fracking. It has to be less cheap. And when it's not cheap, it'll be used much more sparingly, and it can provide some of those, you know, extreme condition backup. And that's fine for a period of time. But when we allow that, that means we've got to do more reductions in other places.
Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. I'll do a wrap up just, a minute before. So we have one more question from the audience here. It's around energy storage. Dianne, I know you mentioned HydroStore, and that's one of the great Ontario-based companies that are able to do large-scale storage using underground compressed air capture or compressed air. I forget what the acronym. Yeah.
Air and water, and they use water
right,
on top to keep the pressure.
The hydrostatic pressure and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so it's a great technology, great company. They're doing a lot of stuff internationally as well now. But beyond that, there's other chemistries. there's a bet being placed, on lithium being the existing technology, but a lot of people have their doubts because of the inability to do kind of bulk storage and large scale kind of transfer of shifting. But the question is around, like, do you think energy storage is ready to play a large role, like in terms of scaling it up dramatically? And and then kind of like the paired question that I would add to that is, if it is ready, are we ready from a regulatory perspective to accommodate it? Because it seems to me there's still a lot of unanswered questions in the regulatory side, where the companies just don't know how to play in the market.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes and no. Definitely storage is ready to play a much larger role. And no, we're absolutely not ready to make that happen. So this is, again, the point that Mike made earlier, that we need to have good rules. And that's why government is so important, which is why I'm trying to get elected, because those rules dramatically determine what kind of things are possible. We are seeing, and I've interviewed on my podcast, people taking a number of different approaches to how we deal with matching renewables to our demand curve. There's people developing zinc chemistry for batteries, which is, we've got lots of zinc in Ontario, right? We've got lots of zinc. We have people like Li-Cycle, not in Ontario, but in Canada, developing ways that we can truly recycle and reuse lithium, so we don't use it once and throw it away. We've got companies using whole buildings basically as storage, so that they can, even things like pre-cooling the building, so that you don't have to use air conditioning during the day. Thermal storage, as I mentioned, the Well in downtown Toronto with their basically large tank of water in the basement that they're going to use for thermal lag. We have all kinds of different ways of matching demand and supply, and we've got price tools that we could and should be using to make demand follow supply rather than trying to make supply follow demand. And things like the super cheap overnight rate between midnight and 7 a.m. That's one of the things I called for years ago, is make it cheap to use the electricity that we have in surplus. And so we can indeed do all these things. You'll see one of the pieces of our plan is to tell the OEB to hold a hearing as to what regulatory changes do they need to make to accommodate this new future. Instead, they've been pushed in all the wrong directions.
And I guess storage, in many ways, you could see demand as a form of storage when you're using digital technologies to control it, right? So like, and Mike, you mentioned that the excitement you have around using electric cars and the technologies to kind of aggregate a lot of small, in the case of electric cars, small storage units, but you can also do that with load, right? You could have air source heat pumps in a community all connected and cycling on and off to level out their impact on the grid, as an example. There's lots of ways to use digital technologies to make management of all these different kind of distributed energy resources kind of operate as a well-tuned orchestra.
And Electra, we talked to Electra just a couple of days ago, and they have a pilot project to do exactly that. It's been really successful, and the ISO is cutting it off. I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we need, based on that conversation we just had, 2 days ago, like, we need a regulatory and a policy framework that enables this kind of innovation. And I would say that it gets back to your earlier comment, Tyler, around outcome-based regulations. Like, let's look at the outcomes we want. And I think entrepreneurs in the marketplace can figure out the solutions, but government has a critically important role in determining what like the outcomes we want to see, and then letting the market figure out ways to achieve those outcomes.
Well, yeah, and non-wire approaches to, like, why can't 1,000 heat pumps all connected digitally together and controlled be treated as an asset and paid for by the utility to put into someone's home, if they're controlling it the same way as poles and wires that you would be putting up, right? So new ways of thinking about how different technologies should be treated the same way as conventional approaches.
And that's what the Electra pilot has demonstrated.
Yes, exactly. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we have to wrap up. we could talk forever. I appreciate you spending an hour and a half with us this afternoon, but it was a very insightful discussion. So I'd like to thank each of you for your insights and your knowledge, and for really pushing other parties to consider new ways of doing things, and we need that kind of nudging in our political offices and in legislatures. So I really thank you for that. I'm going to hand it back to Mike to close it off.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Yeah, thank you very much, Dianne and Mike, for being here. I second Tyler for spending 1.5 hours with us. And yeah, the level of knowledge is really great. And we're counting on you to spread this level of knowledge in the legislature. I think we need it. And with that, I'd like to close. Thanks again to our sponsors, RxN Reaction Hub, MyTags, and Drysdale. Thanks again, Mike, Dianne, Tyler. And we're going to do that again. We'll see, maybe after the elections in the fall, to keep whatever the government may look like on their toes. Or maybe a little later, we have to see. But I think it's been useful to establish this kind of conversation with various political leaders and policymakers, and we'd like to keep the conversation going. So stay tuned. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Well,
Bye.
thanks for having us. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, good to talk to you both again. Take care.
Yeah, likewise, Tyler.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.